3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about the 2024 election, but from a historical perspective. So soon the United States of America will make a choice about the future of the nation that will likely have ramifications for generations to come. America will either choose Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. Now, Harris is obviously the current vice president, and Donald Trump is a former president. But nothing about this election is normal, and the stakes of this election are quite historically unprecedented. And the reason for this is that the competing visions of America promoted by Harris and Donald Trump couldn't be more different. Harris is kind of a fairly normal American politician who promotes policies that are part of mainstream political discourse in America historically, while Trump is a populist-style politician that America has never seen before. He's a convicted felon, and his rhetoric and policies represent this authoritarian style that American politics really has never seen before. For example, Trump's style of politics is often to divide and conquer the American electorate by turning Americans against each other, where he calls out those who don't support him things like communists, human scum, vermin, and the enemy within. I mean, if you just look at his Truth Social account, for example, which, by the way, is his own social media platform. If you haven't seen it, it is quite a strange thing where a presidential candidate will have his own social media platform. It's a little cult-like and kind of creepy in that way, but tells you a lot about kind of the Trump movement and what Donald Trump is all about. And the posts that he makes all the times, they're in all caps, and they're often in this yelling, confrontational manner. And when you read through all the posts that he makes, and he makes tons every day, the guy really does seem to have some sort of mental disorder or something, because this behavior really isn't normal by any stretch of the imagination. I think if we ever had a family member that was constantly posting in all caps on Facebook or something, we would all wonder what's going on with them. But for Donald Trump, he has this special ability where no matter how weird the things he does are, his support base can push it aside with his tunnel vision focused on just normalizing anything he does and making excuses for it. Also, when it comes to Donald Trump's rhetoric, he constantly trashes immigrants, even those that are legal immigrants, when politically convenient. Something that is pretty un-American historically, if you think about from the perspective that America is a nation based on immigrants, though the idea of anti-immigration is certainly a major historical trend where you have these nativist movements in the U.S. You saw discrimination against all sorts of different ethnic groups throughout American history that were immigrating to the country. So, whether the Chinese or the Irish or Italians, it really isn't unheard of, unfortunately, in America. But the most surprising thing about Donald Trump, I think, when it comes to his rhetoric, is just how much he trashes his own country. He doesn't really seem to like America that much, and is constantly calling it a failing nation that only he can save, which is a concept that really has been promoted by authoritarians throughout human history, because this idea that only I can save you all is a super powerful thing that wannabe dictators will kind of use to try to rally support by creating this kind of godlike version of themselves. And Trump certainly likes to lean into that. Obviously, he sells his own Trump Bible, and he shares on social media posts praising him like he's chosen by God. All these little things. He takes anything he can and tries to put it into this myth about himself and weave it into this heroic narrative he's created around his cult of personality. Additionally, though, Donald Trump views the American political system as something he wants to conquer rather than protect, which is obviously evident based on his actions. We talk a lot about actions speak louder than words, and people will say, oh, Trump won't do some of the stuff that he's saying. He's just saying stuff. Well, he actually does do stuff, and we have historical proof of him doing this. For example, in 2020, he tried to overturn the election results, which made him the first president in American history to ever try to overturn the election results by, trying to get Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to certify the election for Joe Biden and inspiring an attack on the U.S. Capitol, resulting in the Capitol being ransacked by his supporters, another historical first in American history. Now, some will say in response to that, oh, well, Hillary Clinton never really accepted her loss, or, Al Gore sent it to the Supreme Court to decide. Big difference there, though, is Hillary Clinton did concede the election, even if she, promoted doubt about it being entirely fair, which she should not have done. And Al Gore, of course, conceded the election as well. Trump, on the other hand, has never conceded the election and never will concede the election, and actually plotted illegally to overturn the election results in many different ways, which were crimes that he has yet to be convicted for. But this type of false equivalence is really popular in the Trump MAGA movement, because you have to find a way to justify these things to continue to support this person that you've fallen in love with, essentially, if you're supporting Donald Trump, because it is kind of this cult-like thing where he can do no wrong, and if he does something wrong, you have to find a way to excuse it. And that's just kind of this aspect of denial that you kind of have to carry around to continue to support and ignore all the evidence of something being off about Donald Trump if you follow him. And of course, he's already plotted to deny the election results if he loses in 2024. And we really have to think about this for a second because, he's been claiming for 4 years that the election has been rigged. And he even recently promoted on Joe Rogan's podcast. And Joe Rogan even asked him, so when are you going to finally show all this evidence? And of course, Trump didn't really have an answer for that and really kind of stumbled and stuttered a bit because I think he was probably surprised that Joe was going to be that direct with him. And probably the funniest moment, though, of that interview was that Donald Trump at one point, said that he lost the election on accident, which Joe Rogan then laughed as a result. But, if you think about it from a psychological perspective, if someone is still claiming for 4 years that the election that he lost was rigged with such little evidence, even when the Republican-controlled Supreme Court with 3 of his own appointees rejected his claims, and he still to this day plays this victim. I mean, isn't this what we teach kids in America not to do? Not to be a sore loser? So it does seem very un-American of him, not just from the law and order perspective of trying to overturn the results, but just from this whiny perspective of, good grief, can you just for once be an adult? But beyond this, perhaps the biggest warning signs for a Trump second term has been the warnings given by those who used to work in his previous administration, where you have American generals that served in his administration calling him a fascist and a wannabe dictator, something that is totally unheard of in American history. In fact, out of the 44 cabinet members that served in his administration that he chose when he became president in 2016, only 4 out of 44 have endorsed him to be president. Now think about that for a moment. If you were a boss of a company or an organization and you have 44 employees and in some type of end of year review, only 4 of your employees gave you good reviews, Like, that's a problem. That's really bad. And it probably means you're not a very good boss and you're not very good at your job. So this, combined with Trump's praise of dictators, his cult of personality, his threats towards those who don't support him, and his promotion of trying to go after those that don't support him, and connect that with the Supreme Court's immunity decision claiming that presidents can no longer be prosecuted for official acts, whatever that means, given that there has been no real definition in terms of what qualifies as an official act. This should be pretty eye-opening for every American out there that enjoys living in a free nation. Because essentially you've given someone the get-out-of-jail-free card, and he's actively promoting the fact that he has that card and actively trying to weaponize that to go after people that he doesn't like. But, these things have been said a million times. And so I think we really have to just take a minute and imagine that, that this rhetoric wasn't so disturbing. And just let's look at his policies for a little bit. Because his policies also just don't make sense. Nor does his claims that, back when he was president, because we can't forget he was president for 4 years, before he lost in 2020. And obviously he lost for a reason. So why people think it would be good to go back to him is really beyond me. Because when you look at how he finished his presidency, he finished it by downplaying a historic pandemic, which he had failed to prepare for. This resulted in a very bad American economy and essentially ruining the economy that he inherited from Barack Obama, who left office with a good economy. And certainly, his poor handling of the pandemic resulted in a higher death toll than it should have been otherwise. Additionally, while president, he paved the way for abortion bans around the country by selecting 3 Supreme Court justices who are very anti-abortion. And the states that have passed abortion bans actually have not let anyone vote on it. So when Donald Trump talks about how, everyone's getting what they want, each state can decide and decide for themselves. Well, really, it's not people deciding. It's what the state governments decide. And so you get a lot of state governments around the country that are very conservative, that are not letting people vote on this and are just outright banning abortion. And that's not what people wanted. And also, people did not want Roe v. Wade overturned. Roe v. Wade was very popular among Americans. It was just the Supreme Court that wanted it overturned because of their political ideologies. And when it was overturned, it was a historically unpopular decision, yet Trump wants people to act like this is what everyone wanted. When in reality, people just don't want the government interfering in their own health care. Because no one wants to have an abortion. You get an abortion because of some type of troubling circumstance. And that's just reality. And then there are his proposed policies for 2024 if he gets elected president again. One thing that might be under the radar for some people, but he's talked about replacing government employees with people that are loyal to him. Because obviously the executive branch has their own group of federal employees. And that's a real disturbing thing in government when you start putting loyalists in positions, in nonpartisan positions, I might add, into government so you can replace them with suck-ups that just do whatever you want. That's not good governance. He also wants to promote isolationism and has talked about potentially leaving NATO, which has been the most successful alliance in world history. And we have to keep in mind that NATO was formed by the United States after World War II to prevent another world war and to ensure that all these countries that had fought in World War II and lost millions of people would never have to go through that again in Europe. And historically, it has been successful so far. Now, you could talk about Ukraine being invaded by Russia. Of course, Ukraine was not part of NATO. And perhaps if they were part of NATO before that invasion, then that invasion may have never happened. But leaving this alliance is really something that doesn't make sense because we've had it since the end of World War II for a reason. So essentially, Trump is when he talks about criticizing NATO and promoting the relationship with Russia, he's essentially doing everything opposite of what every single American president has done since after World War II. So essentially, Trump is saying the foreign policy of every president since he was born was terrible, which is a pretty crazy statement to make, given that American historians would argue that NATO has been very successful. And that's brought a lot more peace and prevented a lot of wars across Europe because of it. Because you notice there hasn't been a country part of NATO that's been invaded since it formed. So I think that's a dangerous thing that Donald Trump is promoting. And if, countries like Russia or China no longer believe that organization has any teeth, then perhaps they no longer take it seriously and look at, maybe I can go into Poland or something if you're Russia after Ukraine. Now, as for his economic policy, he's obsessed with tariffs, which are historically not good for economies because other countries can respond with their own tariffs, or the costs of goods get raised for consumers due to tariffs. So this is typically not an idea that is very successful in the long run for an economy in a globalized world. In fact, even on the Joe Rogan podcast, Trump at one point floated the idea of ending income taxes and replacing it with tariffs. Now, if you believe that the U.S. government should just go bankrupt, that might be a way to do it, because getting rid of income taxes would be disastrous for the economy. And few people realize just not only the economic chaos that comes from these type of policy ideas, but also how damaging it is to have an economically unstable government. Things that all Americans rely on, like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, or the infrastructure that we have in our society. We can all pretend like we don't really need government and the government is just interfering in our lives. But throughout human history, government has only gotten bigger, not smaller. And the reason for that is because government allows for people to have better lives. It regulates and prevents people from taking advantage of others. And certainly there could be too much regulation and too much bureaucracy, but you have to have the right balance. Essentially what Donald Trump is promoting is using government as a tool when it suits him personally, and then just not really caring about government otherwise and letting it kind of fall apart. So essentially, in a nutshell, Trump's economic plans are really quite dangerous for the economy, and there's a reason why economists think that Kamala Harris has much better economic policy than Donald Trump. Mostly just because it's grounded in reality. Not that it's perfect, it's just grounded in reality to a certain extent. Compared to Donald Trump, it is much closer to reality. Next, Donald Trump has also promoted mass deportations, another idea that would be economically pretty expensive to do, and you'd be removing a lot of people from jobs that American citizens don't want to do and won't do, which would then cause major issues for the economy. Not to mention that it is pretty cruel to remove millions of people who have lived here since they were a kid, for example. Illegal immigration is certainly a problem, but not one that you solve by short-term thinking policies based around populism instead of rationality. Not to mention that Trump, at the end of the day, really doesn't care about immigration. If he thought illegal immigration was going to make him popular and get him elected, he would be talking about illegal immigration being a good thing. And the reason why I say that is because, Trump did stop a bipartisan bill in Congress that would have helped stop illegal immigration. And he did just because it would help him politically. Something that shows that Trump is not an ordinary politician. People are absolutely right when they say, Trump's not a politician, he says it how it is. Well, in reality, he's an opportunist. So they're right, he's not a politician, he's worse, he's an opportunist looking out for his own interests. Politicians, at least in many cases, actually care about their constituents. Trump's favorite constituent, though, is himself. And the funny thing is, all these people that now claim to support him, who have kind of jumped on this Trump bandwagon out of their own opportunism, once argued that he was bad for America as well. People like Elon Musk or J.D. Vance. In fact, J.D. Vance said that even God wants better for us than to have Trump. Which is ironic now because Trump is promoting the idea that he was chosen by God. And finally, when it comes to science policy, Trump's understanding of science is almost out of the dark ages, promoting the idea that putting people like RFK Jr. in charge of health in America, a guy who is known for promoting lots of conspiracy theories that regularly attack vaccines, which are, by the way, historically one of the greatest inventions in human history, and have saved millions and millions of lives throughout human history since they were invented. But beyond that, Trump also doesn't believe that humans cause global warming, something which every modern nation knows is a major problem caused by people. And the vast majority of scientists also know this is a major issue that we need to address and take seriously. So if Trump were to win, not only would it be bad for American democracy, or the Republic as some call it, it would also be bad for his own supporters who rely on the government to help them, and those who need a stable economy to keep their jobs and to provide for their families. Not to mention, it would be devastating to the U.S. global leadership around the world, which America would essentially be forfeiting under another Trump term, leaving the world potentially in a pretty chaotic place, likely inspiring more wars and invasions once people realize the U.S. has kind of retreated from the world stage and that anything kind of goes now, because though the U.S. has never been perfect at this, it's hard to argue that there's ever been a country that plays a global referee to prevent conflict more than the United States. If you were to look up the numerous peacekeeping missions that the United States have had throughout American history, they're pretty numerous. Now, the U.S. has also done dumb things foreign policy-wise, so again, there has to be a balance. But completely leaving the world stage is something that usually doesn't end well, because eventually the world's problems come to you, as we saw in World War II. And this is why American allies don't really like Trump all that much. Because across Europe, for example, they view Trump as a nut job who is dangerous and going to make the world a less stable place. Some people think electing Trump will prevent future wars, but the history of American isolationism suggests otherwise. Now, that doesn't mean the U.S. should be invading Iraq, which was done under Republican George W. Bush, not a Democrat, which is important to point out for those now deeming the Democratic Party a party for war. Meanwhile, Trump has been far more aggressive about promoting conflict between Israel and Palestine. So if we're talking about the party promoting war, it certainly seems more like Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has tried to be fairly balanced at trying to deal with the difficult situation between Palestine and Israel. And of course, been promoting Ukraine to defend itself. But no American troops are being sent anywhere. This isn't like what happened under the Bush administration, where you're invading Iraq and Afghanistan. But context doesn't seem to matter enough in American society. So we get these very misguided misunderstandings about what's actually happening in the world. So this is where Kamala Harris comes in. Because Kamala Harris actually does believe in American democracy. She believes that we are capable as a nation. And she also understands how the world works, unlike Trump, who walks into every room thinking he's the smartest man alive. Now, Harris isn't perfect. And something that I think Harris would admit, unlike Trump, but America does not need a perfect president. Because there is no such thing. What we need is someone who actually cares about the country and is trying to do the right thing. Not someone who claims that things are horrible when they're not in charge and perfect when they are. Additionally, Kamala Harris believes in abortion rights. She believes in NATO and working with American allies overseas. Hence why Europe wants Harris to win and not Trump. Additionally, under the Biden and Harris administration, the economy has been among the best in the world when taken into context. After all, every nation is still dealing with the impact of the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has caused inflation to linger throughout society. But the U.S. has been handling it better than nearly every other country on the planet, according to economists. And this is why Americans really need to look beyond their bubbles and view America from the standpoint of the rest of the world when it comes to determining who should be president, and don't just be blind to believe every little thing you see on the internet. You know, you see a lot of memes going around on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram about how low gas prices were back in 2020 under Trump. And the funny thing is, when you look at the date mentioned on these posts, it was during the pandemic, a time where gas prices were very low because there was very low demand, because people were not going anywhere. They were isolated at home. Now, well, the one thing that these images on social media don't show, though, is the high unemployment rate for people losing their jobs. They're like, oh yeah, gas prices were really great, but the economy sucked and there's a freaking pandemic. You know, these things are just ridiculous. But that's the world we're living in, where context doesn't matter. People will share anything that, you know, fits right into the narrative they want to promote about the world, instead of embracing the nuances and complexity of what it means to live in a highly complex society that's always changing. So the point is, Kamala Harris is an American who believes in America, while Trump is an American who believes in himself and views America as kind of this tool for his own benefit. So on Election Day, we will either move forward with a new generation of American leadership or go back to the era of Trump and hope to God that American democracy and society don't fall apart in the process. Now, right now, the polling suggests the race will be incredibly close. Of course, polls aren't 100% accurate. But we have about 7 states that could go either way, which will decide the election. These states include Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. So if you live in one of these states, this is an election you don't want to skip, because your choices are drastically different from each other. So the idea of a false equivalence about, oh, both sides are equally bad, there really isn't justification for that. You either support Trump or you don't, and you support Harris. 2 choices, incredibly different. It's very black and white. It's not like these people have very similar policies or anything else. It's just not even close. So anyone should be able to make a decision unless they just do not care about politics nor the future of their country. And if that's the case, then you really can't complain about anything that happens. So everyone should vote in this election. But even if you don't live in a swing state, this is your chance to have your name recorded in American history as voting to protect American democracy, a historic thing to do and something you could tell your grandkids about. Because this election truly is historic and will be written about for generations to come. Now, when we think about who could win this election, the most likely path to a Trump or Harris win could very well go through what we call the blue wall, which is made up of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And these states are historically crucial to a Democrat president winning, and this is what allowed Biden to win in 2020. So if Harris doesn't win all three of these, then it does give Trump a potential opening to win the election, because she then has to win a state which is less historically favorable to Democrats to make up for losing one, which is still very possible, but just not the easiest path. So if you're watching on election night, keep looking at those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, because if Harris wins all three of those, then she will win the election, because just having those three states will get her enough points to get that 270 to win the United States presidency. And the reason for that is we already know what states are not going to be competitive. We have 7 swing states that are called battleground states. The rest of the states, though, we're pretty certain who they're going to vote for. When you calculate what we know those non-battleground states are going to vote for, and you add those 3 states to Harris's total, she's going to have 270 points, which will win her the election. Now, some people may be concerned about the polling, which shows Trump either very close to Harris or even ahead of Harris in swing states, depending on the polls you look at. However, this could also be due to a polling error. In 2016 and 2020, polling underestimated support for Republicans, but in 2022, it actually underestimated support for Democrats. So it is possible that they are underestimating support for Harris and Democrats in 2024 to try and make up for the past mistakes of underestimating Trump in 2016 and 2020, but we just won't know until Election Day. So there you have it. This could very well be the most consequential election in our lifetimes and one of the most consequential in American history. So if you're ever going to vote in an election, this is probably the time to do it, because it will matter greatly and it will impact your life, whether you want it to or not. Now, as a society, we seem to have lost sight of kind of the importance of taking these things seriously and being able to dissect political candidates and how good they are for our country. And a lot of this is because we've kind of downplayed the importance of education in society and critical thinking to understand. And that has resulted in us really not understanding our nation's history nor the history of the world around us. And the age of the internet, which has, brought lots of knowledge to the world, has also made it harder for people to kind of determine what's most likely to be true or not. Because today we found ourselves in a place where any person with a pulse can pretend to be an expert and promote this idea of knowing some type of secret truth that mainstream society is trying to hide from you. Because we love this idea of blaming these hidden forces for the problems in the world. Because it's an easy solution to a complex problem. In reality, though, this is just a conspiracy theory. And this has led to millions of people rejecting the advice and knowledge of many aspects of life promoted by experts, and instead taking the advice of random YouTubers, podcasters, and influencers online that magically think they know better than the experts just because they did their quote-unquote own research. The problem is, though, is that good research actually takes a lot of training and an understanding of how to look at and examine sources to determine the reliability, to determine author bias, to figure out who created this and why, which plays a giant role in determining how credible a source is. But in the age of the internet, this basic aspect of evaluating sources has completely gone out the window. And with it, knowledge of the world has gone out the window too. And it's given way to this mass consumption of pseudo-history, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, and misinformation promoted by people that either want attention, people that are just really like these alternative theories based off zero evidence, or by political opportunists or even foreign governments trying to promote propaganda to hurt democracies around the world. Russia and China does this all the time. And this is why someone like Donald Trump has really thrived in this environment. And of course, this is only one aspect, because Donald Trump has also thrived due to our dysfunctional political system that suffers from gerrymandering, where people are manipulating legislative districts to give their political party a greater advantage than the other party. Our political system suffers from too much money being thrown in by big companies that are lobbying politicians to promote, to support things that will benefit these companies, and the companies will then fund the campaigns for politicians. And then, of course, is the radical opportunists who are getting elected from these hyper-partisan gerrymandered districts from both parties that promote these radical ideas that then get played across social media and mainstream media, that then creates this fictitious narrative that the people across the political aisle are all crazy and total lunatics. And it brings out this intensity and this passionate hate towards each other in society that's really tearing us apart. And this thing gets promoted constantly by partisan news media. And social media algorithms obviously promote this content all the time. And what it leaves us with is a very divided society that makes people more partisan, that makes people less objective. And it allows for people like Donald Trump to kind of take advantage of this chaos and create these cult-like followings where people get trapped in these echo chambers, and politics then becomes part of someone's identity, like a religious belief, which is not healthy. I mean, just look around. Look how toxic the campaign is by Donald Trump today. And the problem with this is that when things get this toxic, even real warnings based off evidence, like the idea that Trump is a threat to democracy, which there's plenty of evidence for, will then become dismissed as just, propaganda from Democrats. Even when, if you look at the history of authoritarian leaders, the things that Donald Trump is doing is right out of their playbooks. But if you're in the Trump world orbit, you just don't see it because you're so focused in on the groupthink in the world of Donald Trump. So needless to say, following politics in 2024, and I've worked in politics for a while, researching political history and the history of political polarization, and still working in the field of political polarization today. It's been really disturbing to see how these things have played out. Especially because I know as a historian, we're better than this as a society. But this election really is something that is pretty creepy from a historical perspective in America. And that's the result of me wanting to do something that I really never was interested in doing before. But in historic times, you kind of have to do things a little bit differently. And so that's why, for the first time ever, I definitely want to make it clear, who I'm supporting in the 2024 election. This is coming from the perspective as someone who is politically an independent, and I've never had any interest in being a Democrat or Republican, nor plan to be one in the future. In fact, I find party politics often to be toxic and polarizing, and I've never really enjoyed seeing the political system play out throughout my life. But I've also never before seen someone like Donald Trump run for office in American history, who regularly seeks to attack our democratic institutions and divide Americans by promoting lies constantly to create chaos, make it so people no longer know what to believe. I mean, as a historian, I know that we've faced many challenges as a country, but a presidential candidate like Donald Trump is a new one. And as someone who's also very in touch with my family history, I think it's very important to understanding how I make sense of my world and where I came from personally. My ancestors came to America from 10 different countries, seeking a better life. And my ancestors fought for American democracy from the American Revolution to World War II. Now, I can tell you one thing for sure: they did not come to this country and fight for it, risking their lives, so that someone like Donald Trump would eventually take it over. Thus, I want you all to know the situation we find ourselves in right now is quite serious, but that America really deserves better than Trump. Trump wants to promote this idea that America is the problem and that only he can fix it. But the reality is, he's the problem, not America. Thus, in 2024, I voted for Kamala Harris, and I hope you do as well. But regardless of what happens, I also want you to know that there's always room for hope, because I think a lot of us on Election Day will be kind of holding our breath a bit, hoping the election turns out a certain way. But no matter what happens, this election, America can overcome the challenges it faces. After all, we are a nation that was founded on a revolution, that survived a civil war, that survived multiple world wars, and the Cold War. And this moment feels like the latest big test. So time will tell whether we meet this moment or not. But whatever it entails, we can get through it, and we will all get through it at the end of the day. We're human beings after all. We've been here for 300,000 years on this floating rock in space that formed billions of years ago when our universe formed. So on the cosmic scale, this is just a glimmer in time. And even if Trump is a threat to democracy, which he is, it doesn't mean democracy will end. After all, ending democracy is not easy. And of course, even if it does end, you could always bring it back. But it certainly will be a challenging 4 years, and it could end democracy. We don't know. So with that, I leave you. Hopefully, Kamala Harris wins the election. But if not, just remember, there's always hope. So make your voice heard. Believe in yourself and your country and your world. Stay safe, and as always, remember, billions of years led to you. So make the most of it.